With that, next speaker is John Thorhauer, and thank you for moving along. And John, when you get up here, your gizmo, the middle button here on the white advances the slides, okay? Okay, advances the overheads. John is the President and CEO of United Methodist Retirement Communities, serving some 2,600 people in seniors in Southeast Michigan in multiple ways, and John's very familiar with housing and living alternatives. He has nearly 30 years of healthcare facility, senior housing, health services, management experience. Served as President and CEO of UMRC, based in Chelsea, but also facilities in Detroit and around since 2006, and includes adult communities, housing and services, continuing care, retirement communities, as well as partnerships in affordable assisted living, HUD housing, 3 programs of something called All-Inclusive Care for the Elderly, a program for All-Inclusive Care for the Elderly, PACE. How many are not familiar with PACE programs? Not familiar. That's what I thought. John, you've got a good audience. And neither was I until about 4 or 5 years ago. I'm on the board of UMRC, and that's why John has been asked to speak. I know the expertise. He served as COO, multi-facility not-for-profit in West Michigan. He also briefly was in the Gulf as Director of Armed Forces Retirement Home Community in Gulfport. He was responsible for the safe evacuation. There was a flood there that immediately followed John's arriving, something called Katrina. And while he was there, responsible for safe evacuation of 550 residents, staff, and family members from that facility. Got most of the Washington, D.C., did you, or thereabouts, yeah. And serves on multiple boards of the community and on the board of Michigan Veterans Facility Board of Directors, Emergent Health Partners, which is an ambulance service, and multiple boards for UMRC and its affiliates. And with that, I'll be quiet. John, thank you.
Well, thank you. I think Donna did an excellent job giving us some background on part of the healthcare spectrum, and so I'm going to try to cover a different area, and I'm actually going to start a little bit of where she started. So with that said, I'm going to start with aging statistics. I think she gave the top one on the screen there, about 10,000 people a day turning 65. I'm going to give some more specific slides around Michigan because I think this is a huge issue. And if you can come away with something to pass on to our next generation, your children and your grandchildren, I would ask you to do this. And you can see that 36% of Americans contribute nothing to their retirement savings, and more than a third rely solely on Social Security. And we have an awful lot of older adults, over 100, fully a third of them living in nursing homes, which are very high cost, and there's really only certain short-term payments for. So if you can pass something on to our next generation, it's please prepare for your future. We have many more people that are aging in America, and the cost of that is going to exceed our ability for our government resources to be able to pay for those things. And so if you think the government system of payment is bad now, I personally think it's going to get worse because we're going to have more people to provide, less people paying into the system to fund that. So please talk to your children, your grandchildren, your nieces, your nephews, and tell them to please prepare themselves for the future as much as possible. So between 2000 and 2010, we actually have our population of 45 to 64-year-olds and 65 and over growing faster than the population under 45, and so that's pretty large. But one startling statistic, even startling for me, even though I've been in this industry for 30 years, is that just a few years ago, we had no counties in Michigan, out of our 83 counties, 0 counties in Michigan, that had more people over 65 than school-age children. Today, we have 33 counties out of 83 that have more people over 65 than school-age children. And you all know this anecdotally in your own neighborhoods and own areas when you see schools that have been left vacant and gone and been converted into other purposes. And so we're growing as a healthcare provider and a housing industry. We're growing as fast as we can. We don't know collectively if we can keep up. There's just the explosion of growth and future needs that we're frankly having a hard time keeping up with. So this is a slide that you might appreciate being from this area. This is kind of the metro Detroit area, if you will. And you can see the colors on the screen. So if you look on the, I believe it'll be on your left as well. If you look on the left, we've got a lot of green and a lot of blue, right? And so that means that the population in 2010 in these areas where the green and blue are was less than 10% or less than 10 to 15% essentially of adults over 65. If you just fast forward really just 10 years, you can see that we've got many more yellow, a few more orange, and a small spattering of red. And the yellow is 15 to 20% essentially, and orange is 20 to 25% of the population. And the red, which is really pretty significant, it means that in those areas, more than 25% of the people, 1 in 4 people in those areas are over 65 years old. So let's just go, so 2020 is not far away, right? I mean, we want to think it was far away. I thought a few years ago it was far away, but we're almost there, right? We're, less than 2 years away from 2020. A little scary. But if you just go forward another 20 years, just that last 20 years that went forward, look how much red and orange there is now. And fully, there is almost half of the area, and that's this area, essentially the Detroit and Detroit suburbs area, that is more than 25% older adults, or at least adults over 65. And so this is what I'm reflecting on, that we have a not only an age wave coming up. You've heard all those terms, and people coined these great terms, but more important than that, we have a financial issue coming forward as well on how we're collectively as a nation going to pay for those services. So I'm going to, now that I've told you the bad news, I'm going to talk about some of the good news and some of what's out there now that's available. There's some innovative new services, and there's lots of options. And I think in my 30 years in long-term care, there are more options today than there ever have been. And I believe there will be more options in the next couple decades than there have ever been as well. And so I'm going to cover some of those. So this next slide, and I apologize, it's a little hard to see. I couldn't recreate this slide very easily, and I had to take it from another source. And so this is from Leading Age Michigan and PACE Association Michigan. And this particular slide shows a little bit of the progression of different types of services. So if you look all the way to your left, you see community-based services, and you see things like case management and wellness programs, even just fitness centers, frankly, your local LA Fitness or other wellness center, would fit in that. Independent living in a retirement community setting is kind of the least restrictive in terms of it's the most independent option. Sometimes that comes in the form of single houses, freestanding houses. Sometimes it's duplexes or triplexes. Some people call them cottages or villas. Retirement communities come up with all kind of creative names for the word home. But they're homes, they're individual homes. And then in some cases, they're apartments. So there's many retirement communities across Southeast Michigan, across the nation, that offer apartment living that's very independent. And then you start getting into services at some of those. So you have some that are freestanding, have those services. You have some that are more of a continuum. Traditionally called a continuing care retirement community. Today we're trying to evolve that name to a life plan community. They are one and the same thing. They're not any different. It's just a new name. People have started to think that continuing care means that if you live in that retirement community, you have to be receiving care. And so for some people, that's not very attractive. And in fact, I would say as a field, we have added more of the independent housing than anything over the last decade to really cater to the group that's coming. And so in a continuing care community or a life plan community, you have services as well that can be available in independent living. They can take all kinds of forms, from adult day programs to home care delivered into an apartment, to housekeeping services, to meals, to taking care of your yard. There's all kinds of things that can fall in that category of allowing you to remain independent, and in many cases allowing you to have the freedom to do other things like traveling and the things that somewhat make continuing care retirement communities or life plan communities attractive. And as you continue to move through from the independent living to needing services, we have things like assisted living, and we have memory support assisted living for residents that have dementia. We have, again, home health care, which I already mentioned. We have this unique thing called PACE, and I'm going to talk about that because that's a completely home-based model that I'm going to talk about. And as we keep moving up towards more significant care needs, we have skilled nursing. Skilled nursing takes a lot of forms. It can take the form that many of us are very familiar with because we may have had parents or grandparents that actually lived in a nursing home and may have lived there for years in some cases. And that's more residential style, having a heavy medical need and needing 24-hour care continuously. And then there's this last decade or so, this real push towards very short-term stay. People coming into skilled nursing, getting rehab very quickly and leaving. And in fact, it was very common just 20 years ago for somebody to be in skilled nursing and even for rehab. And short-term could have been 100 days, right? Could have been a third of a year, fourth of a year, it could have been very substantial. Today, a typical stay in rehab is about 2 weeks. So it's a very different thing. And because we have so many more options, but we also have gotten very good at rehab and getting people safely back home and having options to support them in the home, so like some of the in-home care. Donna mentioned palliative care and hospice. They also kind of fit on that spectrum, as well as very intense rehab that sometimes happens in a hospital setting where you might be getting 3 hours a day or more of rehab, and you might actually be in a hospital-based rehab unit. It also, there's something called transitional care units, not used as much in Southeast Michigan as in a few other states, but it really is a hospital-based, typically a hospital-based product. And then we have very acute care and hospital stays, things along those lines. So that's kind of the full spectrum. And I know I went through that very quickly, and I am going to go through a lot of the retirement community options in particular. And I think the gentleman in the back, Terry maybe, is your name Terry? I think in the back here maybe asked a question earlier about how you pay for the services and how does it fit palliative and hospice care. And I would just comment on that briefly, and we can go into this a little further maybe in the Q&A session, is that the services are often irregardless of the housing options. So there's tons of options on the service end of the spectrum, and there's tons of options on the housing spectrum. So you can be certainly in a retirement community receiving palliative care or hospice care or home care or home health, or you can be at home in the community. And that is often decided upon by personal preference. That would be one thing. Cost is another factor because sometimes it's less expensive to choose those options in certain settings. Often home settings are often the more affordable, but not always. And then the other is, frankly, what support systems you've got available as well, because navigating all those healthcare needs is probably one of the biggest challenges we have in our long-term care system, is knowing where you can get those services, who provides them, who pays for them, how to coordinate them. And that's often one of the biggest challenges. We have a very fragmented senior care delivery system, if you will, in our nation, and it's very hard to get information. And so there are some good resources, and we can talk about that a little bit later as well. So I'm going to talk specifically about some non-retirement community options here that are fairly obvious, but I just will cover them very briefly. Obviously, many of you live at home. I live at home. Actually, I live in a retirement community, but that's my home. So it's kind of funny that I'm also a consumer of the services that I'm responsible for delivering. But I consider that home because I'm in an independent setting. And so you could use a wellness center, you might go to the senior center, or might not, you may just enjoy things on your own, but that's truly independent living. That can happen with or without a retirement community. It can happen down the street from the library here, or it can happen in a traditional retirement community. Living at home is certainly a lifestyle choice. Living at home with home care or home health services, you could receive mild to moderate assistance. Those are, again, irregardless of the settings. You can receive those kind of things in a retirement community, at home, wherever. It really doesn't matter where you live to receive those type of services. There is a model that's fairly new, and when I say fairly new, it's been around for about 10 years or so in Michigan, and it's continuing care at home, and the services widely vary. And often in that situation, what happens is you buy into a plan so you can stay home in your home outside of a retirement community. And often it's an upfront fee and a monthly fee for services that you may or may not even need right now, but in anticipation of what you might need in the future. So you buy into a plan, and actuarially they figure out what they can offer in terms of services. And then as you age or need those services or have increased needs, those services are available to you, often at a lower or reduced cost than they might be traditionally. There are a number of providers doing this throughout the nation. There are a lot in Michigan that are just starting. I would say this is kind of like long-term care insurance when it started. Lots of options, and I think eventually there will become some standards. Right now there's not very good standards around this. So if you choose something like this, I'd say make sure you fully understand what you're buying and what you're paying for, and make sure it meets your specific needs, because it is not always catered to what your needs are. Living at home with PACE, I'm going to go to PACE next. So if you are a PACE participant, someone that is involved in PACE, your needs would be much greater. And I'm going to give you some great examples, and I've got a number of slides on PACE. So that takes us right into the PACE slide, which is really what would you need to, what services would you need to receive to be in order to be a PACE participant. So let me start out by saying PACE is just an acronym. It means Program of All-Inclusive Care for the Elderly, okay? And when I say all-inclusive, it is all-inclusive health care. It's designed for people that could live at home safely with support services. Doesn't mean they have to live totally independently at home. The individual have to be over the age of 55. They have to be nursing home eligible, which may sound a little counter to the living at home safely, but the living at home safely is with supports. They have to be in the geographic area that's served by a PACE. So right now, most of the lower peninsula, southern part of the lower peninsula of Michigan is covered by a PACE program. Michigan is very fortunate. We have the second highest number of PACE programs in the nation. And so we have more options for people in terms of PACE. If you live in another state like Ohio, you have to live in only one area, a very small geographic area, or PACE is not even available to you. And you have services coordinated by an interdisciplinary team. So if you think about PACE, the interdisciplinary team really helps coordinate all of your healthcare needs. So it's made up of personal care, transportation, primary care, activities, nutrition services, nutrition counseling, social services, home care, pharmacy, and also things that aren't covered on here are physician services. So if you're enrolled in a PACE program, they typically would have a day center. You might come to the day center 2 to 3 days a week. You might see your physician while you're there. You often would see your physician if you're there because the physician's part of the PACE network. You would be involved in activities. You would work with a dietitian. You would work with a social worker to help coordinate services. You might have a home care coordinator and have service delivered in your home. A PACE program would provide your transportation. If you needed to see a specialist, they would actually take you out to see that physician, make sure they've arranged the transportation, and coordinate the health care back with your primary care physician that's part of PACE. But they would manage all of your health care needs. They would manage your pharmacy needs. They would order your prescriptions. They would make sure that they're delivered to you. So it is kind of a little bit of a carefree from a perspective of not having to coordinate your own services. But it is very coordinated. And so what makes it better than a traditional system is if you go to a doctor right now and the doctor refers you to your primary care physician refers you to a specialist, when you go to the specialist says, oh, those tests that your primary care physician did, we don't need those, we need these. And they send you off for some tests. And then you wait, and then they send you the test results back, and it's up to you to make the phone call to say, oh, have my results come back, and what should I do? Oh, you have to come up and you have to go to another visit for your primary care physician. So then you go back, and then you finally get on a treatment plan, and it's kind of left up to you to navigate that, right? In this case, in PACE, we navigate that for our participants. Most of our participants are very frail. Remember, they're nursing home eligible individuals, so they would typically be living in a nursing home. So they do need a lot of help with with coordination of those services. So typically the PACE provider coordinates those services. On top of that, the one very unique thing is that PACE also pays for all those services. So PACE pays for the prescription coverage. PACE pays for the physician's visit. PACE pays if somebody has to go in an ambulance to the hospital. PACE pays for the hospital stay. And even if the PACE participant has to have a transplant, PACE would pay for that if it's medically necessary. So that's a big difference from our fragmented system now, where you have to navigate all these different payment systems and bills. And the way PACE is typically funded is a combination usually of Medicaid and Medicare funds. If you have Medicare services and you're nursing home eligible and you qualify for PACE, Medicare would pay for a portion of that. And it's a little bit more than half of the cost. If you don't have Medicaid, if you're not low income, you would pay the other portion out of pocket, or approximately 45% of the cost. If you are low income, actually Medicaid would pay the balance. So for a low income older adult that would otherwise live in a nursing home, they could be enrolled in PACE, pay nothing out of pocket, have all their care managed, have somebody pick them up at their door, bring them to the PACE center, have them see their physician on a regular basis, have all their health care coordinated and paid for. So it's a very unique program. And the PACE provider is 100% at risk for the cost of providing the services. So they're paid a capitated rate, it's managed care, so they're paid a daily rate for every person they take care of. And if somebody goes in the hospital and stays a really long time, that PACE provider loses a lot of money. However, if they can manage the care and manage the goals that are aligned with the PACE participants, which is remaining independent and at home, the PACE provider actually is economically advantaged by keeping people at home. So your goals as a PACE participant are aligned with the payment system. And a typical PACE program in Michigan in particular is run by a nonprofit organization, and they typically break even about 3 years after starting, and they can make a really tiny margin, about 3 to 5% if they operate really well. And really well means they're providing great care and they're keeping people at home. And so that's part of the beauty of PACE, is that there's huge incentives for them to accomplish the overall goal is to keep people at home. And by the way, the typical PACE participant, 97 to 98% of the PACE participants would highly recommend PACE. It's a program, because it's home-based, that the alternative is often living in a nursing home, which is not necessarily an attractive alternative for somebody when they could be at home with their family, or even in some cases home alone with the supports. So that's a little bit about PACE. I think I may have one more slide on PACE. So I did mention the PACE Center already. I mentioned the transportation and the home care. So, and the key indicator here is that 98% of the time, a PACE program can keep a PACE participant from having to live in a nursing home. So there's a 98% success rate. And 2% of people eventually need to be in skilled nursing because their care needs get so intense that providing the round-the-clock care and all the other services necessary is just no longer practical. So it has a huge success rate, a huge satisfaction rate, and it's a great alternative. So I'm often faced with phone calls from individuals that say, Mom needs to be in assisted living. That's often what we hear, because everybody thinks assisted living is the great attractive thing if somebody needs services, right? And so, and then they say, but Mom doesn't have any money. She only has Social Security. She has $1,000 a month income. That's it. And I will tell you, there's only 2 places in Michigan, if you have $1,000 a month income, that you can get assisted living services. One of them happens to be in Detroit, and one in Grand Rapids. And so there are a total of 95 apartments in the entire state that can offer you that option, truly, if your income's only $1,000. So PACE is a great alternative to that if you're eligible for assisted living, you're likely eligible for skilled nursing, and we can look at whether or not you could benefit by PACE. So PACE is a great alternative for low-income individuals. It's also a great opportunity for people that have income and have assets, But often people that have income and assets have a few more options and may not necessarily choose to buy PACE services before they need them because there is a premium associated with it. So we often find that most of our PACE participants are low-income older adults. I'm going to keep moving because I know time is of the essence here. So I'm going to move on to the continuing care retirement community. I will go through this slide rather quickly, and then I'm going to talk about payment briefly. And I understand the next speakers are going to talk about payment as well. So I'll hit very briefly on the payment. So this is what a typical life plan community or continuing care retirement community looks like. You have independent living, and as I mentioned, you either have apartments or garden homes or cottages or villas, whatever you want to call them. And you have home care services that support people in independent living. If they have a little bit of need, you might have housekeeping services or something like that, meals. On the assisted living spectrum, needing a little bit more service, you have basic care services, which is really personal care, helping people bathe or dress or get up in the morning and get ready for the day. You have some limited medical services, so you often have a nurse that might help with medications and other types of treatments. You have memory care services, and sometimes you offer adult daycare services in a typical retirement community. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have skilled nursing, which, as I mentioned earlier, is that short stay, live in a nursing home versus, go to a nursing facility for short-term rehab and then go back home, or the long-term care. So that's kind of the typical structure. I will tell you that throughout Southeast Michigan, most retirement communities, life plan communities, or continuing care retirement communities have at least 2 to 3 of these services. And what I mean by that, independent living, assisted living, and skilled care. They usually have at least independent living and skilled care, or they might have just independent living, assisted living. So this slide just kind of is another way to look at that, not look at it so graphically, independent living homes and cottages.
Let's fire a slide back up for a second. One press. Okay. So is this the magic button? Because it is difficult to see, but there is.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I didn't tell you that. But there is this button that you don't even have to be, anyhow, okay?
Okay.
So you can help highlight, because it is difficult.
Thank you.
And easier that way. And now I'll shut up.
So now he tells me, when I'm almost done, that you got this great tool, this great magic tool.
I didn't think about it until then.
I'm teasing you. All right. I will use that on any slide that's darker. I'll try to use that to help you all. So I'm sorry, because it is, I can, even on the screen here, it's dark. So I'm going to quickly touch on payments, and I think this slide is bright enough. I probably don't have to use the magic circle, right? But, okay, so it probably makes it worse or harder to see if I'm shaking around. But on the independent living, typically that is private pay or income-based. And what I mean by that is there are basically 2 types of housing in a retirement community setting. There is housing that's subsidized, usually by the federal government or the state, and there's housing that is not. And housing that is subsidized is often on its own, freestanding, independent living buildings that are financed through HUD, Housing and Urban Development, or MSHDA, the Michigan State Housing Development Authority. They're typically 50 to 100 apartments. They're only independent living, and there is a subsidy. And usually, if it's state-sponsored, that there's a portion of the apartments that are market rate, and a portion that are based on income. And if it's HUD-supported, it's usually totally based on income. So that's for independent living. There are options for everybody at every different income level. The toughest one, to be quite honest with you, is the middle income level. So we've got great options for people that have $3,000 to $5,000 a month to spend on housing, and we've got great options for people that have nothing. I mean, and that's across the United States. It's really tough to meet the needs of people for housing that maybe they have $1,000 to $2,300 a month to spend, because to build that type of housing, providing the level of service, it's getting really challenging to do that. So organizations like ours are really focusing on what we can do to, on a national scale, to affect that, because that's becoming a challenge. if I said to you, is affordable housing in your community a challenge, 100% of you would raise your hand. And if you don't say that, let me know, because I'm going to send a whole bunch of people live in your community, right? Because affordable housing and workforce housing is a huge issue everywhere. There's very few places that it's not. Assisted living is typically paid for privately. There sometimes people have been lucky enough early on to have a long-term care insurance that's very generous. Some people are still buying long-term care insurance programs that do work. Some of the older ones actually have some of the better benefits though. And those things are available. And then nonprofit organizations like our organization often subsidize the care through the generosity of donors. And so what happens is people spend down their resources until they run out of money, and then donors have generously paid money to keep people in assisted living the rest of their life. And so if you have means and you think you have, or your family members that you're looking for placement for, and it's very interesting that if you look around Michigan in particular, and you think that there's a chance that your loved one or you might ever run out of money in care services, look to your nonprofit organizations that offer some form of benevolent care, and you can find some assurance on the back end that you won't be out of options. So that's something that I think is very important. Skilled nursing, Medicare and Medicaid, I think the gentleman asked earlier about payment for those. So skilled nursing, if you're there for short-term rehab and you meet all these other rules, including a qualified hospital stay, and you're making progress on your rehab, Medicare will pay up to 20 days typically in full. After the 20th day, they will pay for the next 80 days. They will pay all but a copay, and the copay is typically picked up by private insurance, and the copay is still very expensive. It's well over $100 today per day. But if you have private insurance, typically almost all insurance, Blue Cross and all the other types of insurance typically would pay for that copay. After 100 days, unless you're very low income and can be on Medicaid, there will be no more payment in skilled nursing. So, which can be in Michigan $275 to $400 a day for private paid care. So please understand that that's why other options exist. That's one of the reasons PACE has come about, because most people can't afford the $250, $275 to $400 a day for 2 or 3 years. In-home care is a great option as well. Medicare and Medicaid pay for that. It's a little bit more limited on the Medicaid side. They're very defined on how much service they can provide. It's often slot-based, so in other words, there's only so much funding, and the program that's administering it, when they're out of funding, they're out of funding. So it's not an unlimited source. And of course, you always have an option if you have money in terms of services, right? Because you can buy whatever you need. I mean, I've actually known a very wealthy individual who hired caregivers to care for their loved one on an island in the Caribbean. So, it's possible. If you have money, you can be on a Caribbean island and have all your care needs met. So I'm only going to touch on this briefly. I do have some of these slides as handouts. I brought a few. I didn't bring enough for everybody, but if you want on the back table, I'll leave those. This particular slide is just something I want you to think about. I'm biased, and I'm going to say that. I work for a nonprofit organization. Almost all of my 30 years, with the exception of just a couple of years, has been in the nonprofit world, but I have worked for for-profits and I have served on for-profit boards. I will say I have a strong bias in healthcare and services towards nonprofits because they reinvest their resources back into better services, better care, more providers, and future services than for-profits. Nothing wrong if any of you work for a for-profit healthcare provider. We need both, but I have a personal bias. But I will point out to you in the world of senior living that 80% of the continuing care retirement communities are not-for-profit providers. Only about 20% nationally are for-profit. However, if you look at freestanding independent living buildings, almost 97% of those buildings are operated by for-profit, which means that they do have to pay investors back and are not necessarily going to invest year to year. So with that said, did you have something, Karen? I'm sorry. Did you want me to go back? Oh, you want the magic button. Sorry. All right. Oh, top one, here we go. See, I'm not there we go. I'm gonna highlight the 80% in CCRCs. Independent living is 97% freestanding or for-profit. In assisted living, a lot slanted towards for-profit. And I think the point I want to make here in assisted living is the point I made earlier. If you think your loved one might run out of money at some point, choose your assisted living provider very carefully and understand if they have a benevolent care policy. Because if you're in one of the 78% of for-profits, there is probably a 95% chance that if you run out of money, you will be asked to leave. And so that's a distinct difference. Memory care, very similar, about 79% are for-profit, and the same thing applies there. And then 69% are for-profit, almost 70 in nursing homes. So you can see that the not-for-profits dominate the life plan community in the multi-service space, and then the freestanding options are often dominated by for-profit providers. Now, I will say that's not to say that you can't go into a for-profit freestanding facility and receive excellent care. There are some tremendous organizations that are for-profit that provide outstanding care. And one of the ways they've been able to do that is they have a lot of similar locations and they're very efficient. So please don't misinterpret what I'm saying. You can receive great care, your loved ones can as well, in a for-profit setting. I just have a personal bias towards the nonprofit. So with that said, I'll probably go to the last slide and we'll take questions, which makes you aware of why I'm biased. I work for United Methodist Retirement Communities, as was mentioned earlier, and we operate a lot of these types of services that I talked about throughout Southeast Michigan. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. I think we might have a microphone here.
Did you say earlier that you can purchase what amounts to long-term care for home only, a policy, or long-term care policy strictly, as we understand them? Can you buy one strictly for in-home care?
I think the question was, can you buy a long-term care policy only strictly for home care? So there are two options that I know of that exist now. One is the continuing care at home model. Some of those providers, and they're mostly nonprofits, will offer a home care only type model, and you could actually buy into that. That's a private, it's a privately run, and it's based on the nonprofit that runs it. Most long-term care policies that I've seen, and I've seen a lot of them over the years, and they've changed a lot. Most of them today offer home care as an option because the insurance company is mitigating their costs. I have not seen from a private insurance company one that is strictly home care only.
Okay, because as you know, as you age, long-term care gets very expensive to buy, but that's because it's going to cover nursing. And I'm thinking if you could buy one strictly for a home, that's less expensive.
I think you've hit on a great insurance market if you want to go into the insurance business.
John, the next speakers might know that.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Our next speakers are going to be talking about that in a lot more detail, I hope, right? Thank you. That's a good point.
Okay. We'll go to break.
Thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you, John.
So we will be back. We will begin at 1:15. Keep to that schedule. Food is to the left in the room. Restrooms are to the left outside the room. Take your choice.